My name is Dustin Messer. I am one of the priests at All Saints Dallas. Once a week or so, we talk with an outside guest to help us think more clearly about God, His Word, and His world. Today, we're not talking with an outside guest. We're talking with someone who goes to All Saints and is a friend to many people watching, Abby McCloskey. If you don't know the McCloskeys, Abby's husband, David, serves on the vestry or the board of directors here, and the McCloskeys are involved in many ways, including Abby is one of our lovely people who sing, has a lovely voice. And so we are so happy that Abby is here, and she has 3 beautiful children. Abby, thank you for being with us, and tell us a little bit more about you and your family.
Goodness, I'm so glad to be here. We've been going to All Saints for the last 8 years or so, ever since we moved to Dallas back in 2014. And yeah, we live in East Dallas. I have a policy consulting group. My husband writes books, and we have 3 kids who keep us on our toes every minute of every day.
And I talk to those kids about bugs and lizards and insects every single week. Well, I'm not going to talk to you about bugs or lizards and insects. You have a shift that just kind of is professional things that you write. Your husband writes books, but you write as well. You've written for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, the Dallas Morning News, and you've been policy director on a number of presidential campaigns and think a lot about policy reform and that kind of thing. But you're also a very serious Christian. And so I want to ask you questions related to policy as it relates to family and how your faith has influenced the way you view family, particularly, and maybe policy generally. How did you come to faith? And then maybe a next question beyond that would be, how did you come to have an interest in politics?
Well, I grew up in a Christian household. And so I've been told, that I don't remember it myself, that I was about 5 and I asked Jesus into my heart. We grew up in a Baptist household and don't remember a time of not walking with the Lord. But I do think in college, I spent a year at Vanderbilt before transferring to Wheaton, and that was a really hard year for me. And I remember kind of having a bit of a crisis of faith, and that being one of the first times it felt really deeply personal and like my own relationship with the Lord, as opposed to kind of an osmosis for my family's relationship with Christianity and the church. And then went to Wheaton College after that first year at Vanderbilt, where my faith deepened even more, and then have just been really blessed with people like you and like at All Saints who I've been able to learn from and grow more and more in love with the Lord from. So that's been a huge part of my life. And as it turns out, a decent portion from Wheaton, which is a Christian college, who kind of feel that call to make the world a better place, end up going to DC. And so that's how my now husband David and I, when we graduated, ended up in Washington. And I bopped around. I didn't exactly know. I knew I liked policy and I liked economic policy. And so bopped around a couple different places, worked in the Senate, trade association, and ended up at a policy group, a think tank that looked at a broad range of economic and foreign policy issues. And that's kind of where I started writing and researching and I suppose like carving out this space for myself in the public debate, especially around issues facing families.
Yeah. And how has your faith influenced the way you've thought about attending to the common good and being a good neighbor? And specifically as it relates to policy, what role has your faith played as you've thought about that?
Yeah, I think, and especially, looking over the last decade in particular, as our politics, I think, objectively has gotten more messy and polarized, that there's been a significant amount of freedom in recognizing that neither political party is salvific. And from a policy point of view, that's given me a lot of breadth and freedom to kind of go beyond what any particular political party thinks is correct, to advocate for what I think, based on the research, would be kind of the most effective or efficient way to deliver support to especially some of our most vulnerable populations, like women and young children and single mothers. And so, yeah, I think there's been a freedom in it, of not having to kind of so closely align to any particular ideology of either party and be able to kind of work more common good. I mean, there's also the advantage of being able to do that is I haven't held elected office. So I've been in an advisory standpoint, which means I can kind of say what I believe to be true. Someone else has to, wrangle it through the political morass. But I think that's how it's played out. I went into it working initially on like tax cuts and regulatory reform, things that were really hard to connect, I think, to Christianity. So some issues are more clearly working towards the common good and vulnerable populations, and others like paid leave or like childcare, or like how we deliver support to impoverished people. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's been a freedom in it.
Yeah. So what are, in terms of family, what are some of the big obstacles and problems that probably both political parties, I would guess, recognize as problems before asking questions about solution? What are some of the big obstacles to the modern family?
That's a big question. And people come at it a bunch of different ways. So we know that marriage rates are declining, that fertility rates are declining, that increasingly people are reporting to pollsters are not having kids because of the cost associated with having them, that we see a lot of both like economic and social pressures on the family. And of course, as that family has less and less income, those pressures are often much greater. And so to me, the kind of real inflection point in all of this was the Dobbs decision this summer and the reversing of Roe v. Wade, because when you look at the data of who tends to get abortions, it's 75% are low-income women or impoverished women who report like not feeling like they have a choice. And so I am really glad for the abortion rollbacks, and at the same time have really pressed to say, hey, how can we deliver support for these women? And of course, like our churches and nonprofit community do a tremendous amount, but there's still these really big gaps to be filled. And so how can we make having a family is always going to involve sacrifice and increased cost, and in addition to the blessing and joy that it provides, but how can we make it easier, especially for families in the margin, to have a flourishing family life and have policies that don't discourage marriage, which some of ours currently do, policies that deliver support to families with kids in ways that families actually want instead of kind of how they're currently distributed, and especially making sure that these programs target the people who actually need support, which is actually harder to do than you would think. So
yeah. And what, as a priest, I guess I could give an answer in terms of why I think families are worthwhile and valuable from a biblical perspective. Is there any metric you could point to of why is it valuable for society? In other words, you could just have people who are sort of living as free-floating individual people. We all live in apartments. We come and meet one another. I suppose it's good for society that families are strong, but why is that? Or is there any kind of evidence that that's true?
Yeah. And, that's where you get into all these things, like go beyond just the sheer economics of it. I mean, there's a lot of my more conservative colleagues point out how married households do better financially, and people with kids actually end up being happier. And there's a lot of, without getting too wonky, like noise in that data of who tends to get married or who tends to have kids anyway. And is it really because of those things, or would those people be more apt to be that way anyways? Certainly when you look back historically, a strong family unit has tended to be the backbone of all societies throughout all time. But for me, it's more creating the freedom and opportunity that if people want to continue to form families and have kids and be married, that's something we should celebrate. That is really foundational. It's raising up our next generation of people, both in the church, but also in the country. And we should, if there are ways to kind of make that a smoother experience, especially for really vulnerable families, and then we should be doing that. So I think, and I think that's where some of this work, Dustin, to be honest, of like, and how does family policy, how can we push back on a falling marriage rate or falling fertility rate? A lot of this stuff is also pretty deeply cultural and spiritual. And I don't propose that government policy can reverse those things, nor do I necessarily believe it should. But I do think that on the margin, there are ways that we can just provide basic protections. And I'll just beat you to the next question, like thinking about, paid family leave, which I definitely didn't start out thinking I would being interested in, but when you get into the data that 1 in 4 women return to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. And they cite financial concerns, and that a lot of companies provide paid family leave, but 75% of people still don't have access to any paid family leave from their employers. But this feels like a pretty big gap, and ideally nonprofits and employers would step up, but they haven't. The vast majority of people don't have access to paid time off after they have a baby, despite all the benefits we know, not just from increased life expectancy, but the child itself, but also the maternal healing and family bonding and all these things. And that feels like a pretty basic part of the safety net that we're missing, that every other developed country in the world has, that's not particularly expensive to fill, but just kind of some big signal markers of like, this is sacred time, important time. And as a country, we're going to make sure that it's protected, as opposed to kind of up to the whims of any various employer.
Yeah. So from a policy perspective, there's PTO, other things that could help make it easier to have a family if you want it. You mentioned cultural problems in terms of the desire to have families, things like that. What do you think as a civil society, and maybe particularly from the vantage point of a church, what can we as a community of believers be doing to support the family?
Yeah, well, and I think actually a lot of people watching or listening will have ideas that percolate up of their own. But I do think in some sense, there's really a spotlight right now on the church, on more conservative leaning folks who advocated for a rollback of abortion. We have a lot of pregnancy crisis centers that conservatives and Christian groups run. There tends to be less that happens once that baby's born. And so whether it's, at the church level, thinking through like if there's ways for the facility to provide childcare during the week, or whether it's individual just mentorship with other young moms, I think there's a lot of different ways that all sorts of different people listening would have to fill. I don't think there's like one big solution, but I do think there's a lot of attention right now to issues of life and something that's being called like a whole life ethic, and a really important time for the church and believers to step in and say, hey, we're going to care for these moms and kids in their vulnerable moments, for it to be a positive message and not just one of kind of shame and guilt around abortion.
Yeah, well, that is probably a great place to end. If you've been watching this and would like to learn more about these subjects, and specifically the ways that All Saints partners with moms, babies, adoption programs, things like that, I would love to talk with you. My email is dustin@ascdallas.org. Our guest has been Abby McCloskey. Abby, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Dustin. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Go in peace.